So you said you know a good amount about the connections with the CIA and the USAID. I'm sure a lot of people have never even heard the term USAID before a few days ago, but now it's coming out. Like now that we're cracking open the books and getting a look at it, that it's really had a big part in a lot of the stuff that the government wanted to do, but wasn't necessarily legally allowed to do. So can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of I guess how this thing got started, what it evolved into, and like the depth of how entrenched it is and the way that things work around the world?
Sure. There are really two looks at USAID. One, it was started by JFK, and
Hmm.
you got to go back in history to the Kennedy era. Obviously, at that point in time, we were at the height of the Cold War, a lot of competition with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was actually spending money overseas, a lot of money going into Latin America, Latin American revolutions, a lot of money going into Africa. JFK, knew there was a competition. Most of the aid up at that point in time had literally been military aid from the U.S. Uh, and he wanted, like Eisenhower, wanted to separate space military from space commercial, private, created NASA to make a public space agency. Kennedy
Hmm.
created USAID to do humanitarian relief, food relief, medical, that sort of thing overseas, strictly overseas, and separate it from military aid. And that was the whole genesis of it. Now, it's gone through several iterations, but the concept is always that it's supposed to be primarily humanitarian, whether it's global food relief, relief after disasters, medical aid, responses to epidemics, that sort of thing. That's the reason it's supposed to be there, and it was created logistics primarily. How do you get that stuff overseas and do it in a very public fashion? Uh, the downside is nothing ever stays entirely clean. And,
Yeah.
if you're creating these international channels, what else is going to happen with it? And so pretty quickly, as the CIA became involved with international activities, aid's doing it, they have people working overseas, it becomes a perfect cover for CIA employees moving overseas. What kind of credentials can you have? You can work for a private company or a corporation. You can work for the State Department. State Department was constantly a cover for the CIA.
Mm.
But you can't have our CIA credentials. You got to have, you got to have address. You got to have credentials. So from the very beginning, aid served as a very convenient cover for CIA officers operating overseas. Not doing covert operation, but running offices and doing logistics within aid, I guess, within aid covers. And that's continued, over time. It shifts with different administrations' priorities, but the CIA that and one of the bad things about that is you can't fool people for too long. So, internationally, everybody realized before long the CIA was doing business under CIA cover, just like State Department cover. You had CIA employees carrying state credentials. So
Right.
both the State Department embassies and aid missions became political targets overseas, in countries that were suspecting American intervention or influence. So, that just it became tainted, I guess is really the answer to your question. It became tainted. And that's when you saw revolutions occur, embassies get sacked, aid employees get arrested and imprisoned because it had been contaminated by that CIA connection.
Right, right. I'm almost at the point where I'm wondering if like any of the revolutions that we've seen have been legitimate organic uprisings, or if they've all had a strong, heavy hand of the CIA influence. Because you look back at the 2014 Ukraine uprising with Poroshenko. You look back at all the Ukraine color revolutions. You look at the Arab Springs. You look at the what else you got? Maybe even some Soviet Union stuff, or even when Putin was out of office, a lot of NGOs were trying to. They're paying people in Russia to try to
Yeah.
surround the Kremlin and protest. So is it just 100% of the time there's U.S. involvement against regimes they don't like that are trying to create uprisings?
Well, historically, I think you could definitely say that was true. I mean, if you go back to the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy administration, through the 70s, for sure, most of the I mean, you had two types of revolutions. You had communist revolutions that were inspired, obviously, by the Soviet Union. You had
Mm-hmm.
democratic revolutions, which were basically, let's talk about regime change, because what
Yeah.
you're really talking is somebody wanting regime change swing to your side or the other guy's side. And so
Right.
we've got a long list. We know pretty much all about that now through the 70s and into the 80s. I think one of the things that you're talking about, and we talked about a little bit earlier, around the turn of the century, there was when these color revolutions, actually, the color revolutions started happening largely on their own, quite frankly, because after the end of the Cold War, most of those folks were fed up with Soviet Union and Soviet bureaucracy and heavy-handedness, everything controlled out of Moscow. And it's just kind of like the general, no, I didn't like that. I'm done with that. I want to be independent, one way or the other. So you had a lot of the Orange Revolution and Georgia and a lot of those things going on. But the Bush administration picked up on that, and really there was a huge political movement inside the U.S. At that point in time to spread democracy. This is an opportunity for our side. The Soviets had their time. We won the Cold War. It's our turn. We want to spread democracy. And so there was a lot of money allocated by Congress and under the Bush administration to promote democratic actions. Simple things like poll watching, cleaning up, cleaning up elections, communications, and some of that got shuttled directly to NGOs. Absolutely, there's no
Mm-hmm.
doubt about that. In Ukraine, you absolutely had money coming in from Russia, and you had money coming in from the U.S. And it's a
Right.
fight. It's a dog fight, right? Okay, so how do you parse that out? I did a book called Creating Chaos that
Mm.
actually looked at how much money was coming from where in Ukraine and Georgia, and like, okay, here's what's happening. And the chaos is because you did have, you know, foreign interest, if you will, fighting it out for who's going to have the most influence among these emerging democracies, if you will.
Now, has there ever been a time where that's worked out effectively or the way they intended? Because I can think of a lot of examples where they tried to do that and it went pretty badly and it ended up being worse than when it started. Can you think of any examples off the top of your head where it went well?
Yeah, I wrote another book called In Denial, which
Mm,
the whole point is, can you do this sort of stuff deniably, and will anybody catch on, and does it work? And the answer
hmm.
is no, you can't. People are smart. Perfect question. And I kept in the book, it's sort of like, why do you keep doing it when it never really works?
Yeah.
Why aren't we supposed to learn? But there's this temptation to do it deniably with politics rather than to fight it out. And you
Well,
can kind of go in, we realize we're in a conflict. There are cultural conflicts, there are political conflicts, and there's always the temptation to think that you can kind of do it cheap and dirty in terms of, maybe not cheap, okay, but dirty in terms of loss of life by doing it
yeah.
covertly, deniably, and it just like it wins over and over again. So, but the answer to your question is basically no. You can't get away with it. Everybody always figures it out.
Yeah, and I mean, I ask cynically because I mean the circumstances kind of pushed me there over here. Like I started off, I went to school for national security thinking I wanted to work for the CIA. Then once I started learning what the CIA did, I'm like, oh wow, they are actually causing a lot of the problems that I think are
Yeah,
problems with the world.
yeah.
So let me just get into media. But like when they plan these things out, like do you think their intentions are good and genuine, or do you think they're trying to create chaos so that we have a reason to like oh, need to spend some military money here? Because it seems like there's a like big fear of peace in the world because the military industrial complex ends up shriveling up and dying. Like they had all kinds of problems after the Soviet Union collapsed, so they start advocating for NATO spending. Like I think one of the presidents of Lockheed Martin was like leading the committee to expand NATO, right? So is when they do these things, do you think they're trying to create chaos? Like I think of back to the scenario in Syria where I think there's a lot of NGO involvement there where we just overthrew this guy Assad. Like I don't think he was a good guy, but I think that's a more chaotic situation now that you have a former ISIS leader running the country instead of a hostile dictator.
I think that I think it's always competition. I come out of training in anthropology and cultural anthropology, and it's kind of gets to be tribal. You know,
Mhm.
you think of that on small scale, but even when you ramp it up to administrations, because your question really goes back to who's who's setting administration policy, because the
Right.
CIA really, I mean, if Eisenhower, and by the way, or Eisenhower actually issued an order to kill a foreign president, okay,
Which
uh,
one?
actually in Congo,
Oh, wow.
yeah, um, and sometimes they do it very openly, but Eisenhower also approved a project which would have resulted in the assassination of Fidel Castro.
Mm.
Okay, regime change. It's always a matter of changing somebody else's regime to be in line with us. You know, does
Yeah.
China want to do that? Absolutely. Do we want to do that? Absolutely. Does Russia? You know, it's like a international competition. So it depends on how a given administration wants to play it. But the orders do come from the top, and the directive, like that democracy directive that I was talking about, that came from the top. It didn't come from when the administration sets the policy. And even Eisenhower was worried about whether or not the future administrations could be influenced by the military industrial complex. And
Right.
yes, they could. And concurrent administrations be influenced by other complexes, and even more of them now? You know, is there a pharmaceutical complex? Is there an agricultural complex? Yeah, yeah. So that's real life. But within the agencies, generally these people do their jobs. You know, they're tasked with projects, whether it's regime change or influence or. But one thing that you ask that you've always got to split up is there are different worlds that they live in. Intelligence collection is one thing. You know,
Mhm.
and you need, and nobody can ever go without collecting intelligence, because that is national security. As you know, you've got to have intelligence. Then you've
Right.
got to have the analyst. Where things start crossing the line, then you have propaganda, and which kind of goes up and down with what the administration wants. But then it gets to these special operations people who really do things like on the ground, like regime change and overthrowing regimes and paramilitary operations. So when you're discussing it, it's sort of like, when does an administration turn from just talking, like the State Department, okay, we're just talking, to, okay, let's bring in the special operators. We need a deniable program. Sometimes, in all honesty, I'm not saying I like it, but in comparing what Russia has traditionally done to what U.S. has done, Russia just stands up and says, "I'm going to take over something." The U.S. just generally says, "Oh, I'm not a bad guy," and tries to do it deniably, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, neither one of them necessarily works long term, but one is a lot cheaper than the other. Normally, is a lot
Right.
cheaper than the other. Because
Right,
to
right.
do it deniably, you've got to make it look like it's somebody else, which doubles the expense.
Right, win the moral high ground so that you get more, I guess, worldly support, like you're looking like the good guy.